Okay, so I guess we'll go ahead and get started then. Hopefully everybody can see my screen. This is the screen that you first get to when you log into the system. And so for today's session, I'm going to be going through a spouse client file from start to finish, but it's going to be a really open-ended session. So if you have any questions along the way, feel free to either just unmute yourself or you can send it through the Zoom chat if that's easier. So I'm going to get started by adding a client. So I'll just go up to this add button. And then the first name and last name are key in order to add the client. So you can add the middle name if you have it, but it's not required. Then the email field, that's there if you want to send the client the online questionnaire. So you're going to put in their email and you're going to click this use questionnaire box. And then when you go to add them to the system, it's going to send them off an email that says, click here to access your e-state questionnaire. And so they click on it, then they're prompted to create a password just so that their information stays secure and so that they can come back into it. They don't have to do it all in one sitting. They can come back into it at any time. And then they go through and put in their profile, family tree, asset, and debt information. And anything they fill out in that online questionnaire is going to automatically populate back into your system. So it can really save a lot of time for manual entry. But you don't have to send the online questionnaire. So if you already have their information, you can just go in and enter it yourself. You can send them if you have your own PDF or Word questionnaire, or you can just go through it live in the meeting on your end. So you've got some different options there. Then we'll just go ahead and add Ben to the system. And so today, since we're doing a spouse client file, this means that we're doing wills for both spouses. And because of that, we need to add them both as separate clients into the system and then link them together using the spouse client function. So we're going to go ahead and add Lauren, the spouse, in. So we'll put her first name and last name in. And then we get to the spouse client field. And so you can only do this when you're adding the second spouse to the system because the first spouse already needs to be in the system in order to be able to choose his name from the drop-down list. So here we're going to pick Ben. And this means now that they're linked, any joint or asset information and shared family tree information will be automatically populated in both of their profiles. And then you're also going to have the opportunity to sync the scenarios and the appointments between the two. So it can save a lot of time instead of having to go and plan twice, especially if it's a similar plan. You can just sync it over and then you can make any changes if there were changes between the two. And then we'll go ahead and add in Lauren. So now Ben and Lauren are both in our client list because we're going to be doing both of their wills. So we first have to start who you want to start with. So I'm going to pick Ben. You just click on his name. It's going to bring us into his profile. That was an old one. Let me start with the new one that we created today. Oops, that was 6 days ago. You can search your clients here. There we go, June 29th. So this is what you're going to start with if you hadn't sent the client that online questionnaire. So you're going to start with the client and the spouse because we're doing a spouse client file. If you were just doing a single client file, you would just start with this, just the client's icon. But if you had sent them the questionnaire and they built out their entire family tree and filled in all their assets, once you clicked in to go to their profile, you would see everything that they had done. But if you hadn't sent them the questionnaire, or if you sent it to them but they haven't filled it out yet, this is what you're starting with. And usually what I like to do first is edit the client's information. So I just double click on the client's icon and it's going to bring up more information. So really the key names for anyone on the family tree, you're going to want to make sure the first name and the last name and the gender are filled out properly, just so that the wording of the will comes out right and it doesn't say he or she throughout, it just sticks to one if they identify as one. You can put in also known as too, so if Ben's also known as Benny Collins, that will come up in the will. Date of birth, you can pick it from this little calendar or you can just type it on the line if that's easier. So I usually put June 6th, let's say 1978, and it will automatically calculate that age for you. You can pick your country of birth, you can pick citizenships, multiple if you want. And then all this other information, this is good to have on your file, but it doesn't affect the generation of the will directly. Residency is another important thing because however you set the province as here is how the system's going to calculate the probate tax throughout, but also it's how it's going to know which precedents to generate. So currently we have Ontario, BC, and Alberta, or not Alberta, sorry, that's coming soon. We have BC, Nova Scotia, and Ontario precedents. So you just have to make sure that the client's residency is set to the correct province so that the correct precedents are going to generate for you. The city field's also important because if you want that to appear in the will, it'll say Ben Collins of the City of Toronto, then you can fill out that field. Special circumstances for the client is a place where you can note any potential capacity issues. So you just click it off and you type in the description below. So this again is more for information purposes, and it's to make sure you're protecting yourself from potential litigation. You want to have this stuff really well documented if you expect that there might be a will challenge down the line. And then direct relationships is just going to list who the client's tied to on the family tree. So right now, Lauren's the only other person on the family tree, so it's just telling us that Ben is married to Lauren. And then we'll just save this information. So if you wanted to add anyone to the family tree, it works through direct relationships. So you have to click on the icon that you want to add to get the blue circle around them, and then you go up to the add button and select the relationship. So if I wanted to add Lauren's child, I'll go over to child. Whenever you're adding in a child, you're going to have an option as to who the other parent is. So either it's Ben Collins, the current spouse, it's a new parent, so an ex-spouse that is going to be involved in the will, so that's why you want to add them in, or a single parent. So either they're genuinely a single parent or they have an ex-spouse that isn't going to be involved in the will, then you can pick this option. But I'm going to pick Ben. Then you enter that child's information in. So it's going to be John Collins. We'll say he's a male, date of birth, July 8th, 2000. Oops. And then the special circumstances section for anyone that's not the client, it's a place where you can note any potential relationship difficulties, as you want to make sure this is well documented in case that specific child's probably going to challenge down the line. But the most important thing here is this disability function. So if the individual is disabled, you're going to want to make sure this is marked off so that the system can pick up on the fact that this individual is disabled. So if you're trying to draft a Henson trust later on, it's going to pick up on the fact that you're not just trying to draft any trust, you're trying to draft a Henson trust because you're giving it to a disabled beneficiary. And so it's going to draft that special Henson trust clause in the will. So this is a key trigger here. Now, if you look at your list, you might notice that there's no option for grandchildren or nieces and nephew, but there's still a way to get them on the family tree. It just works through direct relationship. So instead of adding a grandchild right to Ben, we have to add a child to Ben and then click once on the child's icon to get the blue circle around them and add a child to that child. So that's how you'd get the grandchild in. So we're going to say that John's a single parent. And now we can enter in the grandchild's information. So it'll be Lily Collins, female, and then we'll just go ahead and add her in. Same kind of thing for nieces and nephews. You would click on the client's icon, add a sibling to the client, and then click on the sibling's icon and add a child to that sibling. And that's how you get nieces and nephews in. If there's going to be anybody else involved in the will in a beneficiary or a trustee capacity that doesn't fit on the family tree, either because they're not family or they're just so distantly related, like second cousin, that you don't want to build out the whole family tree to get to them, you can go over to this other tab and add them in here. So that way you'll have all their information in the system, and later on when you're picking beneficiaries or appointing trustees, you're going to be able to have them to choose from. So let's say later on, Jordy's going to be involved in this will somehow. So we're going to add him in here. So we'll put Jordy Ayton, and we'll just say he is a friend. Then we'll go ahead and add him in. So later on, when we're picking beneficiaries, we can pick him, or if we're appointing trustee, we can pick him as well. Any questions about the People tab? Nope. Okay, if you do have any questions, you can feel free to unmute yourself or send it through the Zoom chat. The next section is assets. So you're always going to start with this general personal effects asset, and that's just to make sure that you're gifting it in the will, so you're generating a special general personal effects clause. So you don't have to do anything with it. You can kind of just leave it as is. You can click on it. You can value it if you wanted to, but really it's more of a placeholder to make sure that once you get to the scenario section, you're gifting it as an initial gift so that you're triggering a special general personal effects clause in the will, so it's not just falling into residue, so you wouldn't have to worry about valuing everything. For any other assets, we've got a couple of different options. So you can add in all of the client's assets and value them and give them a sense of what the net value of their estate is at this point in time. But for the will generation, really the only assets that you need to add in on this tab are those that are going to be specific asset bequests or registered assets that you want to confirm or do a new designation for in the will. So let's add a couple in. You just go to the add button, then you pick your sort of category of asset and then your type, and then you just go select. For any asset that you're adding to the system, the asset name field is really the most important because this is how the asset's going to be referred to throughout the system and in the will if it's going to be a specific asset bequest. So usually I like to change the asset name to put all the identifying information in. So maybe this is the RBC bank account, whatever the account number is. Just so that if I'm adding in like 3 different bank accounts, if they're all called bank account, that's going to get confusing as to which one is which. But if I know this is the RBC bank account, this is the CIBC savings account, I can differentiate between the assets so it makes it clearer. You can put a balance in as well. And then that probate tax is going to be automatically calculated for you according to whatever you've set the client's residency as. So Ben's residency was Ontario, so it's going to calculate according to Ontario law. And then we'll just go ahead and add. So you don't need to add the values in for the will, but if you do add the values in on the assets, it can make the visual summary a lot nicer, and it can be sort of nice for the clients to get a sense of the value of their estate at this point in time. Let's go and add a house next. So we'll go over to real estate and we'll go home. Same kind of thing. Maybe they have multiple homes, so I want to make sure this one's called the family home. The address field is important for real estate as well, because if you are going to gift this home as a specific bequest, then you're going to want to make sure the address field is filled out because this will populate in the will. So let's call it 123 Anywhere Street. The current value, let's put in, let's say it's $1 million. So there's also a mortgage/encumbrances field here on the asset. And if the property does have a mortgage on it, you're going to want to put it right in this field, whatever the value is. So let's say it's $50,000. And this is because it's going to have an effect on how much probate tax is calculated for this asset. And it's also good to know what asset the debt is associated with. So you'll notice when we get to the next section, the debt section, there's also an option to add a mortgage in there. But if it's associated with a specific asset, I would add it in this field here instead, because it has sort of more of an effect on the probate tax, and it's just good to know where it's associated. The one thing is just make sure you're not adding it in both sections. So don't add it in as a value here and then as a separate debt on the debts tab, because it's going to double count it. So just add it in one place. But if you're adding in that real estate as an asset, just put it in this field. Then ownership, so you can change it. So you can have a joint ownership, you can have tenancy in common or partial ownership. Let's say we're going to do joint today. And then you just click on right on that add owner text, and it will bring up everybody you've added to the system on the family tree or other tab. And I'm going to say Lauren's the other joint owner. And because Lauren is the spouse and we linked them together at the beginning, this means that this family home asset is now also going to appear in her list of assets automatically. So if I switch over to her profile, I can see there's that family home asset. So it saves me time so I don't have to go and do it twice. Then now we're back in Ben's. Let's do one more. Let's go for an RRSP. So again, I'm going to change the asset name so I can identify it in case there's a bunch of RRSPs. The beneficiary field, that's just whoever the current beneficiary is on the policy, and it's just for information purposes. So it doesn't have any effect on whether or not it appears in the will or whether or not you're doing a new designation. It's just strictly for information on the asset. Once we get to the scenarios section, depending on whether you're dragging it into the joint designated asset section, there we can choose whether we want to confirm or to do a new designation. And then before we generate the will, there's going to be a box that we can click if we want that designation to appear in the will. So here it's just for information. Let's say the current value is $100,000. So you might notice that the probate tax always automatically calculates for you, but the income tax doesn't. And that's just due to the variability of different clients' tax brackets. So what we usually do is for an asset like an RSP, we're going to try to estimate the highest possible tax the asset could incur. So we're going to put like 50% of an RSP. And if you were dealing with an asset with a capital gain, we would do like 25% of that gain. Just as a number if you want to show clients kind of an estimate of their taxes at the highest possible that it could incur. So that's the Assets tab. Are there any questions here? Nope. Okay, don't be shy if you have a question. Feel free to jump in. The next section is debts. So this again is more just for planning purposes. It doesn't have any effect on the will generation itself, but you just go to add debt. We're not going to add the mortgage in because we already did in the other section. We don't want to double count it. But let's say they had a credit card debt. So we're going to just say they have a $5,000 credit card debt, and we'll just add that in. So the next section we're going to get to is scenarios. And this is really sort of the biggest section because this is where all the planning happens. And at most, you're going to be planning for each of these three scenarios so that you're covering your bases no matter what happens to your client. So you're going to start with surviving spouse. So this is a scenario where the client's passed away, but the spouse is still around. Then you go to descendants only. So this is the scenario where the spouse and the client are gone, but there's still kids or grandkids around. And then lastly, no descendants. This is like an ultimate disaster. Everyone's gone. What's happening to the estate? So by creating a plan for each of these, you're going to cover your bases. So there's two ways you can go about doing this. You can start by just clicking on a scenario and you can go through it manually. So you can drag anything that's falling outside of the estate into the joint designated assets section. You can create your initial gifts and you can divide up the residue. But a faster way to do this, if you're dealing with a typical client file, you can go up to this little lightning bolt up in the top corner. And these are what we call EPlans. So it's basically like a giant macro that will go through each one of the scenarios and do the planning for you. So to do it for scenarios and appointments, according to whichever one you select. And it's great because it's not like you're locked into any one of these specifically. If any of the details match kind of what you're trying to do, it's a good idea to just run it and then you can go and make any changes that you want. So it essentially prevents you from having to start from scratch. So let's say I like the idea of this spouse with younger children to distributions trust E-plan, because in the surviving spouse, it's going to give everything to the spouse. In the descendants only, it's going to give everything to the children in a trust with 50% at 25, the rest at 30. I like the idea of a two-stage trust, but I don't want to do those ages, but I'll go and change that later. And then no descendants, half to siblings, half to spouses' siblings. And I'm going to want to do something different for that scenario anyways. But I'm going to run this because at least the surviving spouse, I'm not really going to need to make changes there. And so it's giving me a starting point rather than having to go from scratch. So I'm just going to execute. And now I see that it's made some changes. So in the joint designated assets section, it's giving the designated asset to the spouse and it's giving that joint asset to the spouse just to show that these assets are falling outside of the estate. Then in the initial gift section, it's going to give those general personal effects to Lauren because this is going to be what triggers that special general personal effects clause so that it prevents it from having to go right into the residue. And then the balance of the estate, you click on the gray bar, you click on it again. That's how you see the details of the gift. So we see it's an absolute gift to Lauren for 100%. There's no gift over, and that's because it's an absolute gift, and the gift over is going to be that next scenario when we talk about what happens if the spouse is gone, but there's still kids or grandkids around. So we don't need to put anything here. So I don't need to make any changes to this scenario. This is pretty much how I wanted it. So that E-plan saved me a lot of time because I don't need to do anything here. I'll just move to the next scenario, so descendants only. Probably not any joint or designated assets. For initial gifts, you've got those general personal effects now going to the children because it's going to generate another special clause for that. But let me just show you how you would do this if you were doing it manually. So any specific asset bequest, all your assets are going to appear as green boxes over here, and you just click on it and drag and drop it over. Then you click right on the beneficiaries line, and it's going to bring up everybody. So I could just pick John Collins by name, or if you want to do a class, just scroll down the list and you get to the class. And then you can just click add. Then for the balance of the estate, it's created this two-stage trust, but I'm going to want to make changes. So the trustee is the same as the executors, that's fine, but I don't want it to be to when the beneficiary reaches age 30. I want it to be to when they reach age 25. And then for stage lump sums, maybe I want to change this too. So at age 21, they're going to get 25%. So if you're doing stage lump sums, you don't need to also add the at age 25, they get everything else, because whatever you set the duration as is going to be the last stage. So you just do the other stages here, but you don't need to add that last stage as another stage. Then the discretionary payments, so it's unlimited discretion, gift over, first to beneficiaries issue, and then if not, to the other class members. So this looks good, so I'm going to save, so it's going to save with my changes. And if I wanted to copy everything I've done in this scenario over to Lauren's, because Lauren's will is going to be the same for this scenario as well, I just click on her name, this little spouse sync button, and then I sync it over. And it's going to copy the residue breakdown, anything that's joint between the two of them, over to hers. The only thing it's not going to copy over is solely owned assets. So sometimes the system sees those general personal effects as each of their own solely owned assets. So Ben's general personal effects are Ben's solely owned asset, and Lauren's are Lauren's. So afterwards, I might need to switch over to Lauren and gift her general personal effects separately. So it's always a good idea to make sure you're checking everything over just to make sure that everything's synced properly. So that's descendants only. Then we'll go to no descendants. This is like your last scenario, your ultimate disaster. So I'm just going to deal with the balance of the estate. So I don't want to do what the E-plan did, which gives it half to siblings, half to the spouse's siblings. So I'm just going to clear this. I'll just press the clear button. So I'll start from scratch for this scenario. What I'm going to want to do is give half to Jordy and half to a charity. So to do that, I'm not going to run macros. That's a faster way to divide up the estate. But if you're getting more specific and it's not just a common residue breakdown, you're going to do it manually by adding segments and creating gifts within those segments. So adding segments basically just divides up the estate into different pieces, and then adding gifts within those segments specifies what's happening to that piece. So we're going to create two segments. So we'll start with segment 1 for 50%, and then we'll add our gift. So we're going to pick Jordy, 100%. So this just means 100% of the 50% segment is going to Jordy. So we don't want to change this to 50 because we don't want to divide up that 50% segment further. We want all of this 50% to go to Jordy. And then let's just say we'll put a gift over to his issue, and then we can add. So now we've dealt with 100% of this 50%, but we still have 50% we need to deal with. We're not going to add a gift because we've already dealt with all of this 50%. What we need to do is click on this grayed out segments button to bring us back to the main segments page where we can create our next segment, segment 2 for the other 50%. And now we'll specify what we're doing with this 50%, and we're going to give it to a charity. So if it's a charity that you've already added into the system, just scroll to the bottom of the list and you'll get to all the charities you've added in. If it's your first time adding the charity, just go to the three dots and go to New Charity. And really the name field is what counts here. So just ignore this ID field. If you have the CRA number, just put it right on the name line like that. So just don't worry about this ID thing, it doesn't do anything. Just put it all on the name field. And then we can go ahead and add this in. So there, Epilepsy Toronto will be getting 50%. And so now we've dealt with 100% of everything. And we can also sync this over to Lauren if Lauren wants her no descendants scenario to be the same as well. So that's scenarios. I know that can be a lot to take in, but does anyone have any questions about the scenario section? No? Okay.
This quick question there.
Yeah, Tim?
How come there was like 2 circles around there at one time? Like you had at some point, yeah, like that. What's that showing?
So this just means that if you're looking, right now we're in the green one. So of this 50% segment, we've dealt with 100% of it. That's all that means.
Okay.
And then when if we wanted to go to the purple one, it's showing us that we've dealt with 100% of this 50% segment.
Okay, so it's not showing you it's not showing segment 1, segment 2. It's just showing another, yeah, okay.
Yeah, so segment 1 would be the green 50, and then segment 2 is the purple 50. And right now we're in segment 2, so it's showing us of this 50%, we've dealt with 100%.
Okay.
Yeah.
I get it. Thanks.
No problem. So that's scenarios. Then we can go to appointments. So here's where you're going to appoint your estate trustees and your guardians if you need to do guardians. Because we ran the EPlan, it's going to appoint Lauren as the primary estate trustee. To do any other appointees, you just go to this add button and then you select your appointee and then you set your condition. So if you want them also to be a primary, you're going to select none because none as the condition always makes them a primary. If you want them to be an alternate, you're going to put a condition on it. And I usually pick if all specified cannot act and make sure the specified person is right. So it's telling me that Lauren is the primary. If Lauren can't, then Jordy. You could do a further alternate if you wanted. So maybe I'm going to pick John. I'll pick again if all specified cannot act, but I don't want John to be joint with Jordy. I want him to be an alternate to Jordy. So I'm going to exit Lauren as the specified and put Jordy. And so now it's going to be Lauren. If Lauren can't, Jordy. If Jordy can't, John. So you just play with the condition until you get it how you want it. And to sync the appointments, it's going to be in the bottom left. So we're just going to click on Lauren's name and it's going to change Lauren and Ben's name. So Lauren's not her own primary estate trustee. It works the same way for the POAs as well. You just kind of appoint your primaries and your alternates. Then we've got provisions. So there's a couple of things here. The first is funeral arrangements. So if you want those to appear in the will, you're just going to type them right on that line. So let's say be cremated. If not, just get rid of this text and it won't appear in the will at all. Include future members is if you're doing class gifts in the will. Here's where you get to pick whether or not you want future members of that class to be included in the definition. So in that second scenario, we did a class gift to children for the general personal effect. So here I get to pick, do I want future children to be included? So do I want children to be defined in the will as John Collins, or do I want it to say John Collins and any other child born to me and Lauren? So if I do, I'm going to click that box. Same kind of thing for class restrictions. You can restrict certain members of being part of a class. Trust for beneficiaries under a certain age. That's your general trust clause that's going to guide underage beneficiaries to that haven't had specific trust set up for them. So if you've set up a trust in the will, it's not going to affect that at all. It's just if maybe it goes to a gift over to a grandchild and they haven't had a specific trust set up and they're underage, it'll follow this. Then your last thing is secondary will assets. So this is if you're doing multiple wills, primary and secondary. Here's where you can pick and choose which definitions you want included in the secondary will. But if you're just doing a single will, you don't have to worry about checking or unchecking. You can just leave it. It won't have any effect. So then once you've gone through everything, you're going to want to go to this little exclamation point in the circle. And these are what we call advisor insights. So it's going to help advise you. It's like a contextual checklist of of certain planning things that you should consider. So depending on what you put into the system, you're going to get different advisor alerts. Sometimes it'll advise you if you've missed something, like I forgot to put a gender in or a residency in for Lauren. I better go back and change that before I generate the will, just so the wording comes out right. So if I went back and changed her gender, this one would disappear. But not all of them disappear. Like this request prior wills, that's always going to be there. So you can just go through the list and then you can be more confident in your plan and that you haven't missed anything important. The thing beside it is just notes. You could just type in any notes you want on the client, and these notes do appear at the end of the text summary. So maybe you might want to use this for something like check the name spelling on this person, or note that you've done a title search on a property, something like that. Then the last button, this is where you're going to generate all your documents and your summaries for that client. So first of all, there's 3 summaries that you can generate. We'll start with the profile, and it's going to give you a nice sort of collection of all the information that the clients filled out in their questionnaire or that you filled out for them on their behalf, like we did today. So it's got all of their profile, all of their family tree, asset, and debt information. And this is good to have on your file, but it's also good to give to the client after the planning meeting so they can review all this information and make sure that they haven't misspelled any of the names or missed any of the asset details, so they can check that over. The next one is the visual summary, the graphic summary. So it's going to give you a nice visual representation of the estate plan for each of the scenarios and sort of in a funnel system. So this is really nice if you're putting in values on assets, when you're adding the assets in on the assets tab. And it sort of gives you a sense of all of the assets, what's falling into the estate, if there's anything going outside the estate, and what the balance is looking like at this point in time. And then the last one is the text scenario summary. So this has got like all the data, all the information, who the trustees are, what's falling outside the estate, what the initial gifts are, how you divide up the residue. It's essentially the will without the legalese. So those are the summaries. Then you can go to documents. If you're on a trial, just ignore this message. But if you're on the flex plan, when you go to generate your first document or summary for the client, that's when you're going to incur that client fee, that 75 or 110 if you're doing spouses. And these are all the documents that you can currently generate with the system. We actually just added this new retainer letter, so that's fun if you want to check that out. But today we're just going to go over the single will. Here you've got your signing date at the top. You can keep it as is, you can change the date, you can take it out and manually put it in the will later. This registered asset designation box, this is what I was talking about earlier when I was saying that this is how you decide whether or not you want those registered assets to be confirmed or to do a new designation in the will. Got to make sure that box is checked off. Joint designated asset confirmation, this is if it basically just has a clause that says anything that's joint is truly intended to be joint, not held on a resulting trust. So if you've got a client with a lot of joint assets with adult children, you might want to consider this one. Counterpart is if you're signing in counterpart under the new legislation. It's got some wording on that. Simplified is a shorter will with less definitions and powers. So if you generate the regular will and you're finding that it's way too long for what you were looking for, try the simplified one because it's a bit shorter and might be sort of more what you're looking for. Then the will guide's a nice little guide to all the clauses in the will. It's a nice little chart at the end. And then a cover page is just a cover page. And then you can pick any witnesses, anyone who's a user on your account. But if not, you can just pick this blank box and you can manually enter their information in the will. And then you just click on generate and it's going to give you a Word document that is fully editable. So you can make any changes that you want. You can put in clauses, you can take out clauses. It's totally yours to play with. I'll just go through it briefly. So the funds and plans clause, this is because we've checked that registered asset box. The assets passing outside of the will is because we checked the joint asset box. Then you've got some definitions and interpretations. Here we say, my children, it means John Collins and any other child born to or adopted by Lauren and me, because we click that future children box on the provisions tab. Then we've got our appointments. So Lauren, if not Lauren, Jordy, if not Jordy, John. Here's our disposition of body. So this is because we put stuff on the funeral arrangements line on the provisions tab. If not, we wouldn't have this clause. Personal effects. So sometimes you're going to get a little red highlight, and that's because since we gifted the personal effects as an initial gift, it generated this special personal effects clause. But here we have to decide, since we've left it to a class, we have to decide on the division of the personal effects. So is it just going to be up to the trustee's discretion? Then you can just take out ABC. Or if you're going to implement some sort of lottery system, so then you can take out the discretion and have A, B, and C in. Then you've got the residue, so to Lauren, if not to Lauren, this trust for the children, and then ultimately 50% to Jordy, 50% to Epilepsy Toronto. And if we scroll all the way down, here's our nice little will guide that sort of guides to the different clauses in the will. So that's how you'd go through it. Then you would go and switch over to Lauren's profile. You'd go through all of her stuff, and then you'd go and generate her documents as well. And if you ever do get stuck, you can always email me. I'm happy to help. And another good resource is this little question mark up in the top corner. So it's going to bring you over to our help desk. It's going to have lots of articles on how to do different things. So it's like, how do I create a cash legacy? This is how you do it. So before we wrap up today, does anyone have any final questions on anything? No.
Okay, just a quick question of
Yeah.
what do you do to add a user to your account? Like what does
Sure.
that mean? What does that mean?
So that just means that they'll have another login, and it means that so they'll have access to the system under their own login, and you'll be able to add them as a witness. So you just go over to the users tab right here, and then you would just click and add another user. And so depending on what plan you're on, it might incur an extra fee. So I think that if you're on the growing plan, you can have up to 3 users on that account. But if you're on the flex plan, I think it's an additional $10 a month for each user that you add. But here's where you would add them in. And so then they could log in under their own details as well.
Okay. So basically somebody in the firm could do wills and
Exactly.
use a program. Okay.
Yeah. So it can be like a clerk or another lawyer, anyone from the firm.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions? No? Okay, well, if you do come across anything later, don't hesitate to reach out. I'm always here to help. But thanks again for joining me today, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.